An HOA fined a disabled veteran $5,000, completely unaware that his son-in-law was a VA inspector. At 7:10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, my father-in-law opened his condominium door and found a bright orange removal tag zip-tied to the power chair that allowed him to leave his home. The tag read, "Remove within 48 hours or subject to management removal." The HOA had already fined him $5,000, and now they were threatening to take the chair itself. 9 weeks later, the fine was gone. The chair had a formally approved accessibility space, and the board's insurer had opened a major claim file. HOA President Karen Bishop was left reading her own email on a projector in front of more than 100 angry residents. The sentence that ended her presidency was only 7 words long: "Fine him until the chair disappears." My name is Michael Grant, and I am 45 years old, married to Robert Hale's daughter, and working as a senior supervisory investigator within the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. However, Robert did not win because of my job. In fact, my position was the exact reason I had to stay strictly out of the official enforcement process. Robert was 68, a retired Army sergeant who had lived with a spinal injury for years, and while he could stand briefly with support, he depended on a heavy-duty powered chair fitted to his medical needs for daily mobility. Inside his condominium, he used a smaller mobility device, but the larger chair was his lifeline to the elevator, the parking garage, medical appointments, and the Veterans Center, where he volunteered twice a week. His unit featured a recessed alcove immediately outside the front door, set several feet back from the normal walking path rather than in the center of the hallway. For almost 18 months, Robert parked the chair there without issue, until Karen became the HOA president and launched what she called a corridor appearance initiative. First came a warning, followed by a $1,000 fine, then $2,500, and eventually $5,000. In response, Robert provided medical documentation and submitted a written disability accommodation request, while an independent consultant measured the corridor. Even a fire safety review concluded that when the chair was positioned inside a marked zone in the alcove, the required egress path remained entirely clear. Karen kept fining him anyway, dismissing the chair as a visual obstruction before finally threatening to have management remove it entirely. That bright orange tag was the exact moment Robert realized the board wasn't simply confused. Someone had deliberately decided that the aesthetic of an expensive hallway mattered more than his fundamental right to leave his own home. What Karen did not realize was that every email, measurement, medical letter, fine notice, and threat she had issued was already being meticulously preserved. One of those very emails was about to turn a $5,000 HOA dispute into a full-blown federal fair housing problem. Robert had never liked people treating him as fragile, having joined the Army at 19 and spending over 20 years in service. The injury that changed his mobility happened later in life, but he handled it exactly the way he handled everything else, quietly, practically, and without asking for a shred of sympathy. He moved into Jefferson Court after my mother-in-law passed away because the condominium was close to my wife and me, conveniently near a VA medical center, and featured an elevator straight from the garage to his floor. While the unit itself worked perfectly for him, the primary issue was storage, as his power chair was exceptionally large due to additional positioning support, extended-range batteries, and highly specific medical modifications. If he stored the device inside his front entrance, it completely blocked the turning area he needed to transfer safely between the larger chair and his indoor mobility device. The recessed alcove just outside his door solved that problem perfectly, allowing him to park the chair, transfer inside, charge it from an approved outlet, and still keep the hallway entirely clear. For more than a year, nobody objected to this arrangement. But then Jefferson Court completely renovated its common areas with new carpet, new wall sconces, neutral paint, and decorative benches. Karen was immensely proud of the result, constantly talking about giving the building the luxurious appearance of a boutique hotel. Soon after the renovation, residents received a policy reminder stating that personal property could no longer be stored in common corridors. A rule that generally made sense to keep exit paths clear of bicycles, boxes, and furniture. Robert promptly wrote to management, explaining that his chair was not ordinary storage and requesting a formal disability-related exception. He submitted a physician's letter confirming the powered mobility device was medically necessary, alongside documentation identifying the chair as specialized equipment strictly associated with his care. The property manager responded professionally, advising the board that the request should go through a standard reasonable accommodation review. That logical step should have ended the entire argument, but Karen instead treated the word accommodation as just another term for favoritism. The very first fine arrived a mere 3 days later, demanding $1,000, leaving Robert completely baffled as to why anyone would penalize him while his official request was still pending review. I firmly told him not to pay a single cent, and I explicitly advised him not to move the chair until we fully understood the supposed safety issue. We carefully measured the hallway and confirmed there was plenty of room when the chair sat tucked inside the recess. Taking it a step further, Robert paid out of pocket for an independent accessibility consultant who produced a clear architectural drawing showing the chair's exact footprint and the wide remaining path. The property manager simultaneously requested a fire safety review, which definitively concluded that the chair could remain within the marked alcove without reducing the corridor below the required clear egress width. Despite this mountain of evidence, Karen stubbornly claimed the board had a strict duty to maintain a uniform appearance and prevent common areas from devolving into personal storage. Robert was deeply embarrassed by the ordeal, and that bothered me far more than the mounting fines ever could. He had spent decades quietly adapting to severe physical limitations without ever making them anyone else's problem, and now a tyrannical board was essentially telling him that the very equipment making his independence possible looked inappropriate sitting next to their new beige carpet and decorative lighting. If you have ever watched somebody arrogantly confuse basic accessibility with special treatment, tell me what you think in the comments, and share this story with someone who believes rules should be applied intelligently rather than blindly. Robert could have just moved away, or he could have paid the fine and hidden the chair somewhere drastically less practical. Instead, he stood his ground and formally asked the board to explain in writing exactly why the accommodation had been denied, despite the flawless safety measurements. The answer he received back from them was significantly worse than the fine itself. The second notice officially increased the total penalty to $2,500, boldly describing the power chair as an unauthorized obstruction. At that point, Robert retained a fierce fair housing lawyer named Rachel Sloan, who immediately sent a formal letter detailing his disability accommodation request. Rachel attached the physician's documentation, the consultant's drawing, the fire safety review, and high-resolution photographs showing the chair sitting fully inside the alcove. She reasonably asked the board to suspend all fines, while the formal request was being legally evaluated, a move that even their own property manager strongly recommended. Karen flatly refused the suspension, and the board maliciously retaliated by increasing the fine to $5,000. In response, Rachel legally requested all internal correspondence concerning Robert's accommodation, forcing the management company to hand over an email chain that instantly changed the tone of the entire dispute. The property manager had clearly written to the board, stating that Mr. Hale had submitted a valid request. The fire safety review was clear, and they needed to complete the fair housing review before imposing any additional penalties. Karen's documented response to that professional advice was absolutely damning. She replied, "He has had months to solve his storage problem. Fine him until the chair disappears." That highly incriminating sentence was the very first document Rachel told us to immediately preserve in 3 separate secure locations. Shortly after, another email surfaced, where Karen complained that residents had simply paid too much for the building renovation to have medical equipment become part of the hallway decor. While that second sentence was slightly less explosive, together they painted a crystal-clear picture of what the board was actually prioritizing. They did not care about a blocked exit, an electrical hazard, or any actual engineering problem. They cared exclusively about appearances. That was exactly when the bright orange tag appeared on the chair, threatening removal within 48 hours. Robert called me before he even called his attorney, and while his voice remained calm, I knew him well enough to hear the deep anxiety running underneath it. The power chair had cost tens of thousands of dollars and had been intricately configured around his specific medical needs. If the building management moved it improperly, damaged the sensitive controls, or locked it in a storage room he could not reach independently, Robert would be effectively trapped inside his own unit. That exact moment was when my professional role became a serious complication, elevating the dispute into a formal civil rights matter. Up until then, I had merely been helping family the way any son-in-law might, reading legal letters, organizing documents, and driving Robert to his various appointments. I worked inside the VAOIG, a position that absolutely did not give me jurisdiction over a private condominium association's fair housing decisions. My office was not the agency responsible for deciding whether Jefferson Court had violated housing discrimination laws, and because Robert was my father-in-law, I had a massive, undeniable personal conflict of interest. Operating strictly by the book, I formally documented the conflict and immediately notified my entire supervisory chain. I made it perfectly clear on the record that I would not initiate or direct any VAOIG inquiry against Jefferson Court, nor would I utilize any agency personnel. I formally pledged not to access Robert's medical information through government systems, ensuring any legal action Robert chose to pursue would go strictly through his private attorney and the standard complaint process. Acting swiftly, Rachel sent an aggressive emergency demand letter, forcing the HOA to legally agree not to touch the chair for several days while their counsel reviewed the escalating dispute. Robert then officially filed a fair housing complaint through the proper governmental channels, which was precisely when Karen finally learned what I did for a living. Her reaction was instantaneous. She frantically told the board that I was illegally using federal power to intimidate them into submission. That wild accusation might have actually worked to discredit us, except my official conflict disclosure was already time-stamped and filed long before the investigation began. Once the federal complaint moved forward, Rachel ruthlessly focused on the hard evidence that Jefferson Court itself controlled, ignoring rumors to focus entirely on their internal documents. First, she systematically preserved every single fine notice, every accommodation request, the fire safety report, the physical measurements, and the damning emails. The board's outside lawyer very quickly realized their obstruction argument had a fatal weakness. The chair had been professionally measured, and when placed correctly, the corridor maintained its legally required passage. Realizing they were losing the safety argument, the board aggressively shifted their tactics, claiming that allowing Robert's chair would set a dangerous precedent for others to store personal items in common spaces. Rachel's legal response was devastatingly simple. Robert was not asking for a general storage exception. He was demanding a federally protected, disability-related accommodation strictly tied to a medically necessary device. She then hit them with a legal request for all of the building's prior accommodation records, unearthing a massive secondary problem. Robert was far from the first resident who had suffered under Jefferson Court's hostile approach to disabilities. An older woman named Mrs. Patel had previously requested a small, folding rest seat near an elevator because she physically could not stand through long delays. but the board coldly denied it as unauthorized furniture. Another resident with a severe mobility impairment had desperately requested a reserved, accessible parking space closer to the garage elevator, a request that dragged on for nearly 5 agonizing months. A third resident had simply asked for automatic door adjustments at a secondary entrance, but that vital request just sat unanswered for weeks on end. While not every past denial was inherently unlawful, the gathered records heavily suggested that the board operated without any consistent legal accommodation process. The final nail in the coffin came when Rachel uncovered an email Karen had sent during one of those earlier requests, stating, "If we make one exception, every resident with a medical note will want special treatment." That specific sentence was legally catastrophic for them, because under federal law, a reasonable accommodation cannot be rejected simply because other disabled residents might also eventually require one. Once the outside counsel reviewed that severely compromised file, the HOA's insurance carrier became involved almost immediately. The insurance carrier urgently requested all board minutes, accommodation policies, internal emails, safety reports, fine notices, management recommendations, and all prior disability-related requests. Complying with the demand, the management company produced yet another highly damaging document, revealing they had formally recommended that all disability requests be reviewed by legal counsel before any enforcement actions continued. Karen had undeniably received that memo months before the fines reached $5,000, yet the board had deliberately chosen never to adopt a formal legal procedure. Tightening the noose, Rachel legally obtained the security video from the hallway camera, specifically covering Robert's alcove, absolutely destroying the board's narrative. The footage did not show residents tightly squeezing past the chair. Instead, it showed people walking by completely normally, including a maintenance employee maneuvering a massive trash bin right through the corridor without a single issue. Following up, Robert's physician provided a narrowly tailored legal letter confirming exactly why keeping the larger power chair outside the unit was medically strictly necessary for safe mobility and transfer. Crucially, Rachel did not demand that Robert surrender his entire private medical history, providing only the specific details reasonably needed to firmly legally support the accommodation. The board had repeatedly, loudly complained that Robert had not proven enough medical need, but the compiled file proved he had given them far more than enough data to properly evaluate the request. Then, the independent federal fair housing investigator stepped in and asked Jefferson Court one single question that changed absolutely everything. They asked, if the chair could safely remain in the marked recess without blocking the legally required egress, what specific, measurable hardship actually prevented the board from granting the accommodation? The board's desperately drafted written answer rambled about aesthetics, visual uniformity, and preventing future precedent, failing entirely to mention safety, financial cost, or any structural impossibility. That was the exact moment Karen's hallway decor email stopped looking merely insensitive and started looking like the undeniable discriminatory primary motive. Jefferson Court did technically possess a neutral rule against storing personal property in common hallways, and that rule on its own was not automatically discriminatory. The catastrophic legal problem arose from exactly how they behaved when a disabled resident formally asked for a reasonable, medically necessary exception to use and enjoy his own home. Robert was never asking to selfishly fill the corridor with equipment. He was simply asking to park one singular, medically necessary power chair completely inside one recessed alcove. The fire safety report fully supported it, the physical measurements supported it, and his treating physician supported it. Preparing for the board's internal settlement conference, Rachel drafted a devastatingly simple legal exhibit showing the HOA's claim of fire obstruction right next to the independent review proving egress was perfectly maintained. She created another exhibit showing their claim of insufficient medical need, placed directly next to the physician's clear documentation. The final exhibit was just a massive printout of Karen's own email commanding, "Fine him until the chair disappears." There was absolutely no complicated legal theory required to understand exactly why their corporate insurer was sweating bullets, leading Karen to make one last pathetic attempt to shift the negative attention toward me. Standing up at a packed board meeting, she boldly lied to the residents, claiming that Robert's complaint had only escalated because his son-in-law was a senior federal investigator out for blood. Rachel was perfectly ready for the ambush, calmly producing my official, time-stamped written conflict disclosure to prove I had deliberately stayed 1,000,000 miles away from the official decision chain. She then presented ironclad documentation showing there was no VAOIG case, absolutely no VA investigators deployed, and 0 federal threats originating from me. While Karen could try to wildly accuse me of personal bias, she fundamentally could not explain why her own management company had formally advised her to pause the fines. She could not explain why the fire safety report entirely contradicted her obstruction claim, nor why the board maliciously threatened physical removal immediately after receiving valid medical documentation. Above all, she could not legally explain the damning written command to fine him until the chair disappears. Seeing the writing on the wall, the insurer's counsel strongly recommended an immediate financial settlement, while the HOA's outside attorney urgently recommended sweeping structural policy changes. The federal fair housing matter continued independently, applying enough crushing pressure that the board fully understood the existential financial risk of refusing to cooperate. The entire power balance had violently reversed, not because a VA inspector had arrived, but precisely because he had meticulously stayed away. The final legal resolution took several tense weeks to finalize, starting with the HOA completely suspending the $5,000 fine before legally canceling the amount entirely. The aggressive removal threat was officially withdrawn in writing, and Robert finally received a formal, binding, reasonable accommodation, allowing his chair to legally remain inside a clearly marked portion of the recessed alcove. The final legal agreement simply required him to strictly keep the device within that exact footprint and responsibly maintain the remaining corridor passage. The chastised board also legally agreed never to retaliate against him in the future for having requested the initial accommodation or for filing the federal complaint. Then came the massive structural policy consequences. Jefferson Court was legally forced to immediately adopt a strict, written reasonable accommodation procedure. Medical requests could no longer conveniently disappear into ordinary violation enforcement, and both the management staff and the board members were mandated to undergo intensive, separate fair housing legal training. Going forward, all disability-related requests legally had to be reviewed promptly and individually, rather than being summarily rejected just because someone paranoidly feared that everyone else would want a special exception. Taking things further, the corporate insurer and outside counsel legally forced the association to actively reopen and thoroughly review several previously denied accommodation files, including Mrs. Patel's elevator rest seat request. Ultimately, the total financial cost to the association went incredibly far beyond Robert's canceled fine, hammering the board with hefty settlement payments and massive attorney fees. By the time the horrified treasurer finally disclosed the total financial impact to the outraged homeowners, Jefferson Court had absorbed more than $260,000 in combined expenses. Robert rightfully received financial compensation as a direct part of the final resolution, fully along with the complete reimbursement of his agreed attorney fees and out-of-pocket professional costs. Worse yet for the board, the association's insurer absolutely did not cover every single expense without severe pushback, specifically fixating on the legally damning fact that the board had aggressively continued escalating enforcement against written management advice. This financial disaster led directly to a highly contentious special homeowners meeting where Karen nervously stood at the front of the packed room and weakly claimed the board had just been trying to keep common areas safe and orderly. A furious resident immediately stood up and demanded to know why the independent review clearly stated the egress had remained perfectly clear. Another resident loudly asked why the fine had skyrocketed to $5,000, while the actual accommodation request was still sitting completely unresolved. Someone near the back of the room furiously shouted, asking exactly why management had threatened to physically remove a medically necessary chair, well after the board already knew exactly what it was. Karen stammered, attempting to deflect by claiming that the situation had unfortunately become much more complicated, strictly because of unfair outside pressure. That was the exact moment the exhausted treasurer stepped up and silently displayed the original, unedited email chain right on the projector. The slide clearly showed the property manager advising them to complete the fair housing review, directly followed by Karen's arrogant response. "Fine him until the chair disappears." The entire crowded room instantly went dead silent, quickly realizing that there are certain sentences that sound significantly less defensible when read aloud in public. Two board directors who had originally supported the aggressive fines immediately stood up and publicly announced they absolutely would not support Karen continuing as president. An official recall petition began circulating that very same night, and long before the final vote could even be legally completed, Karen surrendered and formally resigned in total disgrace. The federal government certainly did not swoop in to take over the condominium. Instead, the furious residents did something much simpler and highly effective. They completely replaced the toxic leadership that had willfully ignored every single written warning. A few months later, I stopped by to visit Robert on a quiet Saturday morning, finding the hallway looking almost exactly the same as it had before. But perfectly situated beside Robert's door, the heavy-duty power chair sat squarely inside a small, neatly marked rectangle right within the recessed alcove. Mounted just above it was a highly discreet, permanent sign reading, "Authorized Accessibility Accommodation. Keep clear." Robert effortlessly transferred into the chair, casually checked the illuminated control display, and smoothly backed out into the hallway, leaving plenty of room directly beside him for anyone to comfortably pass. Crucially, he did not need me to drive him to the Veterans Center at all, and that was the entire, profound point of this grueling fight. People who heard what happened later almost always entirely focused on my specific job, happily claiming that Jefferson Court had simply messed with the wrong veteran because his son-in-law just happened to work as a VA investigator. While that absolutely makes for an incredibly satisfying revenge headline, it entirely misses the actual, critical lesson of the story. I never legally opened a VA case against the HOA. I never deployed a single federal agent, and I absolutely never threatened Karen using my official government title. In reality, my job actually gave me a strict legal reason to be significantly more careful than almost anyone else would have ever needed to be. I formally disclosed the conflict of interest and stayed completely out of the enforcement process, allowing Robert to win purely because he meticulously documented exactly what he needed. The independent hallway measurements documented exactly where the chair could sit safely, while the official fire review documented that the public passage remained entirely clear. The HOA's internal emails perfectly documented exactly what Karen actually cared about, and the board's own management company extensively documented that it had officially warned them to stop escalating the fines. That ironclad paper trail is exactly what changed absolutely everything in this case. Not a shiny federal badge, not an aggressive legal threat, but a flawless, undeniable record. If a tyrannical HOA, an overstepping landlord, a rogue condo board, or an arrogant property manager ever tells a disabled resident that their necessary medical equipment is simply an eyesore, do not violently destroy property or scream in the hallway. Instead, calmly ask for the specific written rule. Firmly put your formal accommodation request in writing, and securely keep all medical documentation strictly relevant to the specific request. Relentlessly save the physical measurements. Systematically save the internal emails. Precisely save every single legal notice, and absolutely get qualified legal help the second the situation calls for it. If you think Jefferson Court completely crossed the legal line, jump into the comments and tell me exactly where you think it happened first. Was it the very first unwarranted fine, the aggressive $5,000 penalty escalation, the direct threat to illegally remove the chair, or the smoking gun email commanding management to keep fining Robert? Please share this compelling story with someone who has ever had to painfully fight for a basic disability accommodation. And save this video, because the most seemingly boring, mundane documents can instantly become your absolute strongest legal protection. Be sure to subscribe for more satisfying stories where blind arrogance violently meets ironclad evidence, and a person who only ever wanted to live quietly discovers that preserving the truth is more powerful than shouting. Karen spitefully called Robert's customized power chair an aesthetic eyesore, but the binding final legal agreement rightfully called it exactly what it had been from the very beginning: a medically necessary, federally protected accommodation that finally allowed a disabled, retired veteran to independently leave his own home with total dignity.